Good day. Thank you for joining us for this week's discussion, where we'll be looking at school governing bodies. For example, why are they important? How are they elected? What role do they play in protecting religious freedom and parental rights in the public school system? And why is it important for parents to be involved in the school governing body that their child or children attend? I'm Liesl Pretorius, and with me is my colleague, Daniela Illebek. We're both legal advisors with 4SA. We also have 4SA's Executive Director, Michael Swain, with us. And we are very grateful to be joined today by Professor Nicola de Jager. And Nicola is an Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Stellenbosch, the head of the department there. And Nicola's interests includes politics, religion, and democracy, amongst others. And importantly, Nicola is also a parent and currently serving as a member of a school governing body. Nicola, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Liesl. Hi, Daniela. Hi, Michael.
Now, Nicola, let's kick off. In an op-ed that you recently contributed to, the title was to the effect that this is a critical time to defend democracy, and in this context, the powers of school governing bodies are very important. But let's start by looking at the South African school system, the public school system specifically. How is our current system different from that of the apartheid system, and why is this difference important?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we co-wrote that one, Liesl, so yes, thanks. First, to recognize that apartheid was, obviously I come from a political science background, so I'm going to use a lot of that language. To recognize that apartheid was an authoritarian regime, and this regime type speaks to state-society relations. So that regime type will influence state-society relations and, for example, the schooling system. So post-1994, we are in a democratic dispensation, and so we should expect a different form of state-society relations, and this should also be reflected in the schooling system. So under the authoritarian system of apartheid, school governance was centralized and it was controlled by national government. It was explicitly linked to a political program. So we call these state schools. So the schools were effectively extensions of the state. So there was actually the intrusion of the state into society through the schools. An example of how this worked. So until 1953, 95% of Black South Africans who received an education received a missionary-based education. So these were missionary-controlled schools. The then Minister of Education, H.F. Verwoerd, was deeply concerned by this, as it was a creating of a cohort of educated, independent thinkers that understood their inherent value of personal worth and dignity, and they were being established within them ideas of hope and the ideals of social mobility. So he responded with the Bantu Education Act of 1953, effectively centralizing education and recasting African education to align it more closely to the overall aims of apartheid policy. So let's go. So this is state schools. So under apartheid, under authoritarian systems, state schools, state-led, centralized, and with the education system being used to socially re-engineer society. So post-1994, into our democratic dispensation, a decision was made to move away from the centralized authoritarian top-down approach to a cooperative governance system, recognizing the need for joint responsibility between the national government, the provincial government, educators, and the local school governing bodies to organize, to fund, and to govern the schools. So we see this in the White Paper 1, which is the basis of our Schools Act, which emphasizes that school governance power, and this is really important, that school governance power or the governance power of schools was to be placed within their respective communities, and there should be minimal state intervention. So we can see that state-society relations, so an emphasis actually on society's responsibility. So it gives recognition to parents' authority and that parents have the primary responsibility for the education of their children. So it's a model which effectively places significant decision-making power over issues such as school fees, admissions, nominations of staff outside the control of the state and closer to the community in which they find themselves. So yeah, if I can emphasize. So now instead of state schools, we have public schools. So they are decentralized, localized, and representative of the community in which the schools find themselves.
It's clear that the apartheid government was really threatened by healthy schools with healthy input from the communities. And it just shows how important this is, this decentralized system for parental rights, protecting parental rights. It's basically grassroots democracy in action. And the school governing body is such an important part of this. The school governing body is basically the vehicle through which this democratic cooperative governance system is, you know, embedded in the school and facilitated through the school, and the maintenance of that is ensured. But what is a school governing body? For those listeners or viewers who might not know, how is it composed? What are its functions? What powers does a school governing body have?
So in accordance with the Schools Act, every public school is supposed to have a school governing body. So it's a largely elected, it's not completely, but a largely elected body responsible for the governance of the school, but in particular for the drafting of policy. So the school's mission and vision, the admission policy, language policy, religious policy, disciplinary code, code of conduct, dress code, etc. In fee-paying schools, the school governing body is also responsible for the appointment of staff members. So because parents are paying for the school fees and are paying for those salaries, they get to have input into who's going to fulfill those roles. They also oversee school finances, the buildings and property of the school. It's important to distinguish the school governing body from the school management team, or the SMT. So this is your principal and your vice principals. They are the professional body which actually do the running of the school. And this also obviously includes the teachers. I always kind of use, it's not a perfect analogy, but an analogy of the parliament and the executive. So your governing body is like the parliament. They deal with the legislation, and the executive are the ones that effect it. So they put it into action. They're the professional body. It's also important to say that the school governing body is unpaid. So the members of the school governing body may not legally receive any monetary payment. So this is voluntary, this is community, this is after hours work. So what is the composition of the school governing body? It is local, it is representative body of the school community. So it includes the school principal, ex officio, and then the other members are elected: parents, teachers, admins, school learners. The governors are elected on a constituency-based system. So parents elect parents, teachers elect teachers, learners elect learners. But according to the Schools Act, the parents are required to be in the majority to ensure that they have the final say regarding key governance matters. And then the chair of the school governing body is a parent member, so they can only be elected from the parent members.
Well, thank you for clarifying, Nicola. And I think that's a great analogy to understand the difference between the school governing body and the management team, and how exactly that interaction works. And it emphasizes the importance of the parents, because they come from the community. And, you know, it's this idea that because it's public schools, because the school belongs to the community and not to the state, the parents, as representatives in the community, you have learners there, you have teachers there, these people on the local level will really have the best idea of the nuances of their school community, the needs of their school community, and they're in the community. They're accountable. They're not somewhere far off in a provincial department, or even worse, a national department. They're right there. Their own child is in that school.
Absolutely.
So we touched on parental rights, and parental rights are, school governing body is the main vehicle through which parental rights are protected in the public school system. They're the representation of the institutional authority of the parents, if you want to put it in more formal terms. But how do school governing bodies go about this? How do they protect parental rights? And because we know that international law that's binding on the South Africa in our own education policy documents, the white papers, it's emphasized that parents bear the primary responsibility for the education of their children. So they have this inalienable right to determine, things, to choose the form of education that they regard as best for their child, and specifically around matters such as language, culture, and religion. So how do school governing bodies help protect parental rights?
Okay, so yeah, you've emphasized a number of points that I would also raise. So agreed. Parents, by virtue of being parents, have the primary responsibility of the education of their children. For Christians and for many other faiths, this is first and foremost a God-given right and responsibility. But as you say, it is also recognized in international law and in South African policy and in the white paper, as you mentioned. Since the primary responsibility for the education of a child sits with their parents, parents enjoy certain fundamental rights and responsibilities, which enable them to ensure the child receives the kind of the quality of education they desire. So two things: school governing bodies set the tone of the school. So they draft, as I spoke earlier, about the mission and the vision. And one of the things they can do is they determine the values of the school. So they can determine, as I said, the tone, the environment of the school through the values. So values that are representative of the community and the society which they find themselves. So values such as personal responsibility, dedication, hard work. And these ensure inside this also that the SGB gets to determine the policy. So, for example, the religious policy. And they are given space for the expression of the religious community in which it finds itself, and to allow for that expression to be also protected inside the policy. So it's policies, mission and vision, those types of things where the SGB has an important role. But secondly, through the governance and the oversight role that SGBs have. So they can keep an eye on state creep. And they can keep an eye on actors which would use schools to give them access to children for ideological and or harmful purposes. For example, keeping an eye on the content inside the books, keeping an eye in terms of the programs that are used for the life orientation curriculum. So it is important as for parents through the SGB to ensure the school's not used again for social engineering purposes, or for the promotion of ideas and values that are actually counter to the norms and the values of the community, or for the purpose of undermining parental authority. And we see this, unfortunately, there's definitely a strong move of social activists. We see it domestically and internationally with rather radical ideas trying to influence the policy and the curriculums of schools. So South Africa is actually a predominantly conservative society, and we're also a largely Christian society. And therefore, this should be, and should, in terms of a democracy, it's not to be unexpected that this will be represented inside and should be represented inside school governing bodies and inside their communities. That's how a democracy works. So what we're seeing in terms of these agendas, if I can call it that, in the attempt to use a schooling system to promote ideas which are counter to the ideas and the values and the norms of the South African society. We see this, for example, in curriculums like the comprehensive sexuality education, which, to the credit of parents and organizations which pushed back, it was going to become compulsory and prescriptive within life orientation. But there was a massive pushback, and this now became a guideline. And I think it's important for parents and people to understand that CSE is a program. It's not that program. So comprehensive sexuality education is not compulsory. It's merely a guideline. But if you look inside the scripted lessons plans, it promotes what we call, or what they call rather, sexual rights of children. And actually this sexualizes children, where they say it doesn't, but it does. And it presents a radical gender ideology which deconstructs the family and undermines parental authority. So when parents are involved, they can have a look into the curriculums, like these life orientation programs, and they can ensure that a program is a program suitable to the community and suitable to their society is chosen. And there are alternatives out there. So they are not in any way beholden to use the comprehensive sexuality education, for example.
I mean, Professor de Jager, that is so great to hear, because I remember when this whole CSE issue first popped, Michael and I were in Parliament and we were going through different reports from the pilot projects where the content had been piloted in schools without parental consent. And there seems to be what you were mentioning earlier as state creep. It seemed to be such an example of state creep, because when parents were shocked by the content that was being piloted, the way the report captured it was as in they needed to be persuaded that about this content, and that this content would actually help their kids. So it was almost as if they don't have the right to object to this content. They're objecting because they're like ignorant, basically. Like, that's the tone of the report, is that these parents are too dumb to know what's in the best interest of their child. The department knows best, and they just need to get on board with the program. But actually what you're saying now with school governing bodies made up of the majority of parents in that community, and every community is different. Even within one province, communities are different. So parents from that community can say what they want in the content for their school, as long as obviously it meets the minimum requirements set by the minister. But I think that was just such a beautiful example of state creep, the mentality we can often see coming through from agencies as well, about, parents don't actually have rights. This is a state school, buster. They just need to get on board. And how wonderful it is when parents actually realize they do have rights and they actually use them.
Absolutely.
I think, Nicola, just, our conversation up to this moment, it just emphasizes the importance again of school governing bodies. And it shows that that parents need to be involved, and parents and the general South African citizenry, we need to be active to ensure that there's that pushback on state creep. Now, the state in education has an important role to play. The state, each sphere of government has an important function, and if it's fulfilled in the right way and people stick to their mandates, there's no problem with that. Within that defined role and responsibilities as set out, in line with the values and the framework of the Constitution. But you cannot have state overreach, because as you've mentioned, parents have inalienable rights because they are parents. So that right, that legal authority, it doesn't originate with the state. It is delegated to the state, and the state must, work within the limits of that, how that power is delegated to it. It cannot, overstep the boundaries of that power. And what the state needs to do in basic education is, especially with regard to the governance of public schools, is to support and enable parents to exercise parents' rights, not the state's right, parents' rights, to ensure that their children, parents' children, not the state's children, receive the kind and quality of basic education that parents desire and that are in line with parents' own beliefs and morals, as is absolutely their right, guaranteed in our own South African law and binding international law. So that leads me to our next question, Nicola. The role of school governing bodies in upholding democracy and religious freedom in particular. What are your comments and thoughts on that?
So I want to highlight two principles of democracy. Obviously, there are many more. And the first one is representation. And the second one is that democracy, unlike other regime types, so your authoritarian or your democratic regime type, is a system of separations. So to go back to what I was saying earlier, with an authoritarian system, there's a creep of the state or the public into the private. With a totalitarian system, there's a complete control of the private by the public. So there is no space for the private. So these two principles, firstly, the representation. So school governing bodies are critical to this understanding of democracy, of representation, as it ensures its connection to the community. It's not a top-down, it's a bottom-up, it's a representation. So the SGB gets to represent the interests and the values of the community and the society in which it finds itself. So they represent, that school community. A democracy, as I said, unlike other regimes, is a system of separations. Without this separation, there is no liberty. So just as a basic principle, if you don't have that separation, if you don't have that public-private divide, it's just the public. And then people are not citizens, they are subjects to the state. But we are in a democracy and we are citizens with rights and responsibilities. One of these is the school governing body. So the separation between the state and society, where the public authority, and just as you were saying, Liesl, is limited, and it's a delegated authority. So we have what we call the social contract with the state. So we delegate an element of authority to them, but their responsibility is to also protect the autonomy of society, to protect the rights of society, and that's also to protect the SGBs. So states are there to support schools and SGBs so that they can function effectively. So SGBs don't exist at the behest of the state. If the role and the responsibilities of SGBs are curtailed, then it means that parental rights and that sphere of authority of parents is being rolled back and usurped by the state. And this is why something like the Bella Bill is concerning. Was it the Basic Education
Laws Amendment Bill?
Laws and Amendments Bill, because it's already it's a small creep, but it's into admissions policy, and it's trying to kind of centralize it around the provincial government. So it's already that usurping, that taking away of the authority of parents. So that's why it's important that we input into these bills, but also be aware of them and aware that it's an encroachment on a sphere of authority, a parental sphere of authority, as embodied in school governing bodies.
How easy is it, and maybe even how prevalent is it, that government in the form of the DBE actually overrides the rights, the roles, the responsibilities of school governing bodies? Because it's wonderful to have the theory, but there's also the practice. What is your experience in that regard been?
I mean, as being on the school governing body, I mean, my experience is that I think there's a natural tendency to centralize. So it's not specific to South Africa. It's just a natural tendency to centralize authority. And especially where you have examples where things don't work well. And the exceptions are used to, well, it didn't go well there, therefore we must centralize the authority. We must take it back. We must take back, and we will do a better job. So I think the Bella Bill is a nice example of that creep that is starting to happen. So these were roles and responsibilities given to school governing bodies that have already started to kind of pull back and start to say, no, we're going to enact that. We're going to tell you what to do. People still have that state school mentality, that the state tells us what we must do and we accept it, and not understanding, no, it's just a phenomenal system that we have. It's super exciting in the sense of the level of autonomy that is given to parents to be involved.
You have this wonderful opportunity, you have this wonderful system, make the most of it, because it's in the best interest ultimately of your child to do so.
Professor de Jager, in your opinion, do you think that firstly, the Department of Basic Education staff members are aware of the powers of school governing bodies, like where their powers as state officials starts and ends, and where parents' power and authority starts and ends? I'm asking this specifically thinking back to the fact that scripted lesson plans, and Michael can jump in here and remind me about what the funding was, but it was something ridiculous, like hundreds of millions of rands that had been received from overseas that had been used to draft inter alia these scripted lesson plans. So basically scripts for teachers to read and scripts for your child to work through in class with very graphic content. I remember when the scripted lesson plans were first made public after members of parliament insisted on seeing what the department was doing with these. 4SA ran a press release and we had to use the mildest images because we didn't want to fall foul of pornographic laws for sending out a press release with what your 8-year-old would be learning in class. And so with this background of scripted lesson plans, with external foreign funding being drafted, being put in teachers' mouths, being said, no, this is going to be compulsory for your child, do you think the state firstly realizes that it's not state schools anymore? And then secondly, do you think that the department has done enough to educate persons about school governing bodies? And where can parents go to learn more about school governing bodies if this is something that they're considering?
So I agree. I think the education and the awareness is needed for state officials as well as for parents. So those who are in DBE positions, they need to understand that they are not in a lording it over position. They are in an environment of creating a conducive environment for schools to operate, not for them to dictate. And the problem with that is the state creep, and what we're seeing, what you're referring to with scripted lesson plans from comprehensive sexuality education, was there was massive international money which came in from it. And so it's actually almost a using of our state by activists. So it's not even necessarily the state, but the state machinery that is being used to actually implement activist agendas and goals. And maybe I should just quickly say this here, but with the comprehensive sexuality education, it's important, it's promoted, as I mentioned, sexual rights, the promotion of sexual rights. But if you delve into where does that come from? Where does the idea of sexual rights of children come from? And then it comes from the very, very dubious work of Dr. John McKinsey, who he collected data from pedophiles and child abusers to the point that he actually paid them for the data. And he used data from children, babies, toddlers, and he used that to actually argue that children have sexual, they are sexual beings. And so from that, we get these sexual rights. These are the origins of some of the programs that are being attempted to be brought into our schools, and they are internationally funded, and our states institutions are being used to bring them in. The other one is gender ideology, radical gender ideology, and the idea that gender is a social construct. And if you go back, where does that idea come from? And it comes from a psychologist called Dr. John Money. And if you look at the experiments that he did, he experimented on children. And you're not allowed to do that. And yet those ideas is what's feeding these kind of programs, and these programs are coming into our schooling system. And this is why it's so important to have educated parents in school governing bodies and taking up their authority. So there was a second part of your question, is where can parents get to know more? So FEDSAS plays a very important role. We would say like a trade union or school governing bodies, and most schools or many schools, should we say, subscribe to FEDSAS. And when you come onto the school governing body, they provide training. So they are really an amazing resource for parents, for school governing bodies, in terms of educating and preparing parents. So I would recommend FEDSAS, and then also organizations like yourself, Cause for Justice. There are many organizations that are educating people, but people need to actually educate themselves, to actually go and look it up and find out.
So Nicola, we've discussed how parents can become involved and why it's important, there's awareness and education to push back on state creep. The question really is, can parents afford not to be involved in the school governing body of that their child attends? And I think the answer is obvious, but let's unpack that a little. What are the risks when parents are not involved in their child's school? And you can get involved by standing for the school governing body. And if you don't understand, you can at least vote for who's on there, so that you know that the people who are on there will serve the community interest, they're persons of character. So, but what are the risks of uninvolvement?
I see we all shook our heads. We all need to we recognize the importance of this, and it's an amazing opportunity. I would love to have met the drafters of the white paper and that Schools Act, and those who understood the importance of a school governing body. And in light of our history, we've learned from this. We implemented a school governing body and a decentralized system in light of learning. So let's not forget that. Let's not go back. And I think we as parents have this opportunity. So with any democracy and in any institution inside of a democracy, like a school governing body, it requires a responsible and an engaged citizenry. And if you don't make the decisions, if you are not informed, if you are not engaging, somebody's going to make those decisions for you. And in this case, they will make the decisions for your children. And they don't always have the best interests of your children at heart. And when we see this with some of the programs that are attempted and some of the agendas that are attempting to come in, it's not necessarily with your children's best interests at heart. So one hopes that we as parents have the primary, our hearts are geared towards our children for their best interests. So it's a reminder that we are citizens and we're not subjects. We're not subjects. So the idea of being citizens is exemplified in the role and the responsibility of school governing bodies. If parents abdicate this responsibility, they risk losing control of, as we said, the kind and the quality of the education that their child receives, and they give it over to others. And as I've mentioned before, we've seen two things that are concerning. One is the governmental creep, which we see with the Bella Bill. And then the second one is we see with social activists with really radical agendas, for example, the comprehensive sexuality education. And these will creep unless parents actually are engaged and responsibly engaged.
Now, Nicola, you are an engaged parent. As I mentioned early on in the conversation, you are currently serving as a member of a school governing body. Tell us a little bit about what is your experience of serving on a school governing body and what have you learned from this experience?
So I think one of the important things is to realize that when you stand for the school governing body, we often go idealistically, so I'm representing my child's interest, and that's not the point. The point is not to go in to promote the individual interests or rights of your child. In representing, when you go in, although you are constituency-based elected, when you go in and you serve on the school governing body, you represent the interests of the school. So you represent the best interests of the learners and the school as a whole. Indirectly and inadvertently, this obviously is in the interest of your child because you are setting the values, you are setting the mission, you are setting your influence in terms of the staff appointments. You actually are influencing the quality of the school, the direction of the school. It's an enormous responsibility, but it's a deep privilege. So I want to say that I am a working mom. I'm a full-time working mom. So I always say that this is my nighttime job and it's my weekend job. So it's a lot of work. It's really, and it's not paid, but obviously the benefits are just incredible. And you actually, my experience is that what you suffer for, what you give time into, you love. So I've found for myself that I've learned to grow my love for my kids' school and for the learners and for the school community, that I really enjoy them, and I want to see the school flourish. I love it. I love it when the school flourishes. And I think that's something that's your reward and the benefit that you get from being on the school governing body. So I think it's important to recognize that you represent the school as a whole. You represent the learners as a whole, and you are contributing towards a value-based, healthy, well-governed, flourishing school. What a privilege.
So I think a lot of people will probably be asking, well, how and when can I put my hand up to get involved? Because it is, I understand, a process, and it is an election that takes place, and then that body is in place for a significant amount of time, so that it can actually work together and cohesively advance the best interests of the school. Can you give us a sense of how do we do that, or how do people who are interested do that, and when is the next opportunity?
Sure. So I think the first thing is to ensure that you have, one never really has the time. So that's perhaps not the right question, but it takes a lot of time. So once you've made that commitment, realize that it's a 3-year commitment. So when you serve on the school governing body, your term is 3 years. You can run for a second term, so long as you have a child in the school during that term. So obviously you have to have a child, you have to be a parent to sit on the school governing body. And when you make that decision, realize that it's going to be nights, it's going to be weekends, it's going to be regular meetings, you're going to be interviewing staff members, you're going to be part of disciplinary hearings. It's a lot of work. You're going to be drafting policy. So make sure that you are committed for the full 3 years. So we're about to, I don't want to say we're not about to end, but this term ends this year, and then the next round starts next year. So you will be elected, and the schools will actually announce it. Actually, I think it comes from the Department of Basic Education initially, but then the schools also announce that there will be elections and that people put their names forward. So you will write some kind of motivation, have a short CV, and this becomes available to the school community, and then they vote for you. So even if you don't stand for the school governing body, it's important to see who is standing, to get to know them, understand what do they stand for, and then to vote with an informed basis, and to know that they are will they represent the best interests of the community of that school.
Nicola, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such an insightful discussion. This is a subject that I've read up about, but I've learned so much more and gained a deeper understanding. Just the importance of school governing bodies to protect grassroots democracy in action, to protect parental rights, to protect the best interests of children, to stop state creeping, to stop harmful content, coming into contact with children. And like you said, it's hard work, but obviously it's very rewarding. I can see when you speak the love for your school community, it lights up on your face. And I think the takeaway is parents cannot afford not to be involved, but also they need to have the right heart when they're involved in the school governing body. It's not, I'm here for my child, I'm here for the school community. And that comes through so beautifully when you speak. And that is exactly why school governing bodies are so important, because they're in the community. They have the heart for the community, and they can serve the community, something that the provincial or the national government simply cannot do. So thank you so much for this discussion, Nicola. It has been very, like I said, insightful, and I really hope that our viewers will take away the importance of getting involved in their child's school.
Thanks, Liesl. Thanks all.
Good day. This is Daniela Ellerbeck, the Legal Advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa. Remember to like and share this video, and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.